Coming up ahead in this episode of Xtalks Spotlight.
The great thing about home visits is that it's a flexible solution. It does start with the patient making a decision whether or not they want to have home visits, and then once they make that decision that they'd like a nurse to come to their home and decrease their burden of having to travel to the site, there's a second line decision made by the principal investigator. So the principal investigator is then considering whether or not that patient is a good fit to have visits in the home. And that decision can change.
Hello, and welcome to Xtalks Spotlight, illuminating insights from subject matter experts and industry thought leaders. I'm Sonia Hunt. In this episode, we're asking the question, how can smarter sample collection empower patient-centric trials?
Clinical trials face growing pressure to prioritize patients while meeting strict regulatory requirements and delivering high-quality data. Decentralized sample collection is one approach gaining traction, bringing clinical visits closer to patients while keeping principal investigators fully accountable. Through structured delegation logs, real-time communication between nurses and principal investigators, and thorough adverse event documentation, sponsors can maintain compliance and oversight even for at-home visits. In this Xtalks Spotlight, I spoke with Colleen Gosa Nalepinski, Patient and Site-Centric Solutions Strategy Director at IQVIA, about how sponsors can design trial strategies that meet patients where they are, without sacrificing operational control or compliance. Colleen has over a decade of experience as a principal investigator and sub-investigator at a Phase 1 research site, and she specializes in first-in-human trials, thorough QT studies, pharmacokinetics, and biosimilar trials. She brings a deep understanding of how to maintain oversight while meeting patient needs. Thank you for taking the time for this Spotlight interview, Colleen.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk more about home visits.
So to start us off, how can sponsors ensure principal investigator oversight and regulatory compliance when clinical visits happen at home?
I wanted to start with just reassuring everyone that patient safety is our top priority when we're reviewing protocols for home visits, both for feasibility and for the actual execution of the home visits. Patient safety is always the top priority. And so patient safety and PI oversight, they go hand in hand. When we review a study protocol and we're looking at the schedule of assessments and the objectives of the protocol, we're first looking at, what will be safe for the patient to have conducted in the home. And then we're also considering what is within a nurse's scope, what countries allow home nursing, and then how PI oversight can be maintained during that home visit, whether or not, for example, telemedicine would be needed. We also think about making sure that PI oversight is maintained through proper nurse delegation. So all of the nurses that IQVIA offers to the sites have proper education, training, and experience to be listed on the delegation log. And we do provide the principal investigator the nurse's credentialing packet so that the principal investigator can make a proper delegation through reviewing the nurse's CV, their training record, and their experience from other clinical trials. And then lastly, we leverage IQVIA's DCT regulatory team to make sure that the countries we're proposing home visits in have acceptable laws around home visits for clinical trials.
Now, Colleen, what would be the right balance between nurse autonomy and principal investigator responsibility in remote patient interactions?
A lot of that comes back to comparing the remote home nurse to the study site nurse. So the nurse is leveraging their clinical skill set while completing a home visit, and they're using their skills to determine whether or not the site needs to be contacted. And we do have communication plans in place with the sites so that if a nurse is completing a physical assessment and they notice an area that is warm to the touch and perhaps erythematous, They will use their clinical judgment to decide whether or not the site should be called in case the PI would have any further assessments or questions for that patient at that time that could help with the patient's care. And then a common question we receive is about adverse events and how those are how those are handled in the home setting. And so just like the study site nurse, we want to make sure there's proper delegation of the nurse activities. So the nurse will collect any information that the patient reports around new signs or symptoms that they're experiencing, or just any current signs or symptoms that the patient is experiencing. But it is up to the principal investigator to then decide if the things the nurse has shared with the principal investigator are in fact an AE or not. And then it is up to the PI to decide what the AE term is, along with the severity of the AE and the causality of the AE. And then that allows for proper delegation of the nurse.
And what if a clinical trial requires local labs? Can home nursing still be used?
Great question. And yes, home visits can still be utilized when a study protocol requires local labs. And this is something that we'll commonly see when a quick turnaround time is required for local lab samples, safety samples, so that decisions can be made for the patient whether or not to continue in the trial. And so when we think about using local site labs, there's 3 things that we need to consider to make sure that this is feasible. The first thing we need to consider is whether or not that site lab will allow samples from outside collection of their facility. So what I mean by that is, will that site lab accept samples that weren't drawn at their facility, samples that were drawn in the home setting? And once we have that determined, then the next thing we need to consider is there any special labeling that we need of the tubes? And we want to make sure that the tubes are the same types of tubes that they'll accept for their devices within the laboratory. And then lastly, we need to consider what the site lab's schedule is. We want to make sure that that site lab is open to receive our samples that are drawn in the home. So for example, if the site lab closes at 5 p.m., we would probably want to have our visits then conducted during the morning so that our samples would be received in the afternoon at the site lab.
And to wrap up, could you explain how decentralized models can be designed to improve patient experience without sacrificing principal investigator discretion?
The great thing about home visits is that it's a flexible solution. It does start with the patient making a decision whether or not they want to have home visits. And then once they make that decision that they'd like a nurse to come to their home and, decrease their burden of having to travel to the site, there's a second line decision made by the principal investigator. So the principal investigator is then considering whether or not that patient is a good fit to have visits in the home. And that decision can change during the course of the clinical trial. It could go from a principal investigator saying, I don't think you're a good fit at this time to have visits in the home, but we can revisit this in a month or 2 and see if we can then opt you into home visits later in the trial. And then it can go the other direction too. Like, for example, the patient I talked about earlier who had the area of erythema that was warm to the touch, it can go from a patient having visits in the home to the principal investigator saying, you know what, let's take away that option at the following visit because I'd like you to come to the site and I'd like to see you for in person for your study visit and check in on how you're doing. So it's a great solution that allows patients to express, what their wishes are, but it still has that PI oversight of making sure that it's in the best interest of the patient's safety based off of the principal investigator's discretion.
Well, thank you very much, Colleen, for speaking with us today. We really appreciate your time and insights.
It was a pleasure. I'm happy to be here and have had the opportunity to answer some questions.
We look forward to learning more about IQVIA's work in designing patient-centric trial strategies. Thank you all for joining us for this Xtalks Spotlight feature. We hope you enjoyed the discussion.